Good morning. It is Thursday, July 31st, 2025, 11:38 a.m. Eastern, 8:38 Pacific. Broadcasting live from Toronto, this is the Mothcast. In the next hour, we're going to be talking about the report from Arms Embargo Now that just dropped, I believe yesterday or Wednesday. Might have been Wednesday. There's been it follows with a lot of what we've been talking about already in terms of how much Canada has been in for funding the genocide in Palestine. And so we're talking a bit about that because it's a pretty great in-depth report that talks about some loopholes that the Canadian government is able to exploit in order to send weaponry and parts to Israel, as well as where in Canada these parts are coming from, what they're going towards in terms of actual military equipment. I'm trying to find a comfy spot to sit. So we're going to be talking a bit about that. There's already been some reporting on this from, the Palestinian youth movement held, I believe that was, they held a press conference about this, I think yesterday or Wednesday. I know Rachel Gilmore has done some reporting on this, or is about to, I think, drop some reporting on this. But just since, especially with last stream, talking about how much, Canada's spending has increased over the last decade in terms of military exports to Israel. It's roughly double now what it was in 2015. I think this is relevant and worth sort of following up with. I hope you're having a good week so far. If you're in Toronto, it's a bit of a gray, kind of cooler day out there today. I think it's only hit about 20 degrees. It looks like there might be some rain coming. As just a live look at the CN Tower cam there. So let's get going. Thanks so much for tuning in. And then, of course, at the end of this broadcast, we'll be rating the Majority Report stream to get the American story on what's going on south of the border. So this is sort of like the main thing I want to sort of talk about today. Reporting from Arms Embargo Now. About Canada's military exports to Israel, and how much is going there, and sort of what's being sent, how it's getting there. So the first thing that kind of I think is really kind of important to touch on is just sort of anecdotally, as I've been doing research for streams, I found it sort of just a bit tricky in order to find kind of numbers and in terms of dollar value or in terms of volume of goods being sent over to Israel by Canada, which, in one respect I thought, okay, well maybe, it's not as much, or it's slowed down, or it's been, paused, what have you. But it seems that it's, of course, it's a bit more nefarious than that. I'm not saying what we're about to talk about is the reason for why, um, the reason for why my own searches are not bearing as much fruit as I had hoped. But it's more about why official reporting about our exports to Israel might not necessarily be giving the whole picture. Because so from the report, this was sort of the first thing that jumped out at me, and I think is really kind of important. Um, so the the report sort of starts off a bit talking about how about how goods are moved to Israel from Canada, and that there is supposed to be a bit of a checks and balances on military exports. There's a permitting process that has to be done, and per Canadian law, it has to be sort of gauged kind of what the risk is for any kind of military weaponry being sent abroad to be used in any kind of sort of human rights abuse. Sorry, just turn on the fan. It's a little warm in here. So it's supposed to be gauging what the risk is that any weaponry sent abroad will be used in any sort of like human rights abuse or war crimes. Um, and that sort of applies to all but exports to the U.S. because this report from Arms Embargo Now cited a very interesting report in the Toronto Star from uh, last August, so August 2024. Um, and I'm just going to sort of share this passage with you here. So, the Canadian government is legally obligated under the Export and Import Permits Act, international treaties to assess whether there is a substantial risk that exported items could be used to commit or facilitate serious violations of international humanitarian or human rights law, or serious acts of violence against women and children, and then to stop any such exports. Um, and so, but because Canadian military trade with the U.S. is not subject to the same rules as other countries, because of a Cold War era treaty that has integrated North American defense infrastructures, giving the U.S. access to Canadian industry and near free reign to export military goods to other allies. So what this sort of basically is saying is there is this just kind of loophole that exists, such that Canadian and American military production lines or weapons manufacturing production lines are effectively like a single infrastructure kind of thing. It's treated as a single continuous supply chain or manufacturing line. So stuff that gets manufactured here often finds its way to Israel through the U.S. because there's no permitting required in order to send those goods to the U.S., as well as the reporting requirements are not as stringent or are not as detailed or thorough because of this treaty that was put in place during the Cold War, likely when there was fear about Soviet planes coming over the Arctic to attack and bomb Canada and the U.S. So that means that there aren't any of those same checks about are these weapons going towards, like what was just mentioned, human rights abuses, war crimes, violence against protected populations, that kind of thing. And so for the government to step in would be, as is noted here by Philippe Lagacé, who's a professor at Carleton University, would constitute political interference. So that would probably, per the terms of the treaty, that would probably open up avenues of retaliation by Washington in terms of penalties, fines, sanctions, other kinds of penalties that we would face. And so I also think that this just generally speaks to kind of our proximity to the core of the empire, with that core sort of being the U.S., but that the U.S. sort of has this ability to influence and dictate, like we talked about a couple streams ago, kind of our foreign policy, as well as parts of our domestic policy as well. And this is one of them. So this is how this makes it a little harder to track about what's going to Israel, because this is sort of, effectively treated as just domestic movement of goods. This is treated the same way, more or less, as if this was just goods moving from, Alberta to Quebec. So that means that that creates some murkiness around export figures. And so, it may mean that there is, more, we are exporting more to Israel than we know, or at least that you and I know, because of course, folks that are in the seats of power of, foreign affairs, or the Prime Minister himself, probably have a much better idea of how much is going to Israel. But you and I, as far as what we know, is there's probably more. There could be more weaponry or other kinds of goods going to support Israel than we know. And so when you hear about how much money America is throwing at Israel, it's worth sort of stopping and thinking that that while it's America that's throwing that money, there's a not insignificant amount of that Canada has contributed to. That Canada is sort of like built right into the American war machine, the American empire machine. And so yeah, I thought that was quite interesting, quite alarming. So yeah, so that's sort of, it's called a loophole, but I mean, I don't know how much of a loophole it is, because it's not necessarily exploiting some kind of vague terminology in the law. It's a treaty that exists. It's part of a treaty that exists that's specifically meant to expedite the movement of military goods and resources between Canada and the U.S. So it's not so much as a loophole as much as it's just part of our alliance with the U.S. That's part of why we're, it's probably a good bit of why we're often termed as like their best friend or their little brother, or that kind of like close relative or familial rhetoric in terms of our relationship with the U.S. This is probably a good a bit of an explainer why, or a good chunk of an explainer as to why. So that also means too, because we talked about on Tuesday we talked about how Carney had stopped approvals for new permits for military goods to be sent to Israel. So that is effectively a hollow kind of signaling, because as we just see here, there is not the same permit requirement to send these weapons to the U.S. to then be sent to Israel. So just because, there's no new permits coming through doesn't mean that stuff's still not finding its way over there. So another thing to keep in mind, if, when someone brings up, well, no more new permits are being approved, well, that just means that there is a clampdown on stuff going directly to Israel, and instead now it's being routed through probably New York or Chicago. Actually this report from Arms Embargo Now does have a pretty extensive breakdown on sort of what's coming from where. So here they have this map here that kind of just visualizes. Here, I'll try and zoom in a little bit for you here. Yeah, it's not going to help too much. It visualizes there. What's like sort of the journey from Canada to Israel, and there is some kind of direct shipments sort of finding their way there, but as you'll see, there's a lot of this sort of routing through kind of New York down here, through Chicago, coming through kind of Germany, France, and then finding its way down through, so either going from Europe to Israel, or kind of coming, through kind of the Emirates and then to Israel. So there's like these indirect pathways that likely are being used to kind of shed some of that regulatory burden. What I thought also, this was something that I can't remember whose video I saw this in. It could have been Gilmore. It could have been the content shared by the Palestinian Youth Movement. But the airlines that are being used to send these goods, it's not just like cargo flights. It's like also passenger flights are being used to move these. So over 100 flights were required to move 47 military shipments to Israel, and about 64 of these flights were commercial passenger flights. So on some of the airlines included Air Canada, Air Transat, Air France, Lufthansa, yeah, so like Air Canada, Air Transat, those are big, those are ones that are commonly flown on by passengers. Air Transat to some destinations, these are the ones that are, in terms of like U.S. destinations, they'll probably head down to like Florida or, the Gulf of Mexico otherwise, or Air Canada, is flying all over. And so they are, with civilians on board, they are, packing these planes with, tons of, ammunition certainly, and also electronic systems, and guidance systems, or components for electronics or guidance systems, as we'll see in a second here, for stuff like Israel's F-35 variant. But then those goods will then sort of go through places like New York and Chicago before heading to, Abu Dhabi, New Delhi, or they may come instead through, as you saw it on the map, they may come through, Frankfurt or Paris or Athens, or through Germany or France or Greece. before kind of finding their way down to Israel. And then there's this sort of part of the report here. It sort of just talks about kind of what's being sent from where. So, for example, like we talked about General Dynamics in Quebec, that that had it was last March, had that $80 million contract with the U.S. Department of Defense to supply these mortar rounds. And so it kind of just goes through here, kind of sort of the origin and destination, and the actual kind of like what's actually being sent. So we have the cartridges, which is this actual round right here, this 120 millimeter mortar cartridge, and then navigation guidance systems, electronics. So some of this is going right from Montreal down to New York, so JFK here. But I noticed too a good chunk of stuff also routes through Pearson in Toronto, and if it's not coming from Toronto, it tends to often route through Toronto. So the actual like cities that stuff is coming from in Canada primarily include Halifax, Ottawa, Montreal, Calgary, Vancouver, and then the GTA or the Greater Toronto Area. And it seems a lot of stuff, if it's not going right down to the U.S. or abroad immediately, it gets routed through Pearson Airport, and Pearson Airport's airport code is YYZ. So yeah, we have, and it's not just General Dynamics. We have CMC Electronics, Marinvent Corporation, CAE Inc. And the primary receiver tends to be Elbit Systems, which is the largest weapons manufacturer in Israel. And so this is just covering shipments from April 2024 to July 2025. So we'll see here the most recent shipment was from General Dynamics to Tel Aviv, and it was these cartridges here, and you'll see. It departed July 18, 2025. So that would have been the Friday before last. And it got there last Wednesday on the 23rd. So again, here's Prime Minister Mark Carney saying we've stopped approval for new weapons permits or other kind of military goods permits to Israel. And yet, just as a week and a half ago, up to a week and a half ago, Israel's still receiving goods from us because it's not going right there to Israel. It's not going directly to Tel Aviv. It's going through New York, or it's going through, I believe this is Delhi in India. Because if it's not, so it's also like, if it's not necessarily going through a U.S. route, it will go through another indirect route because there's not going to be the same scrutiny on a permit to exports to India or to Europe as there are on exports directly to Israel. It's more likely you'll get an export approved to Germany, right, as opposed to Israel. So I also think too that's also something interesting and worth bearing in mind with the French President Emmanuel Macron, talking about the recognition of a Palestinian state, and that there's this very strong rhetoric condemning the genocide in Palestine. Of course, they're not calling it a genocide; they call it the war in Gaza. But still, there's still stuff coming through France and these other European powers, including Germany. All these countries, worth noting, that were signatories to that letter we talked about on Tuesday. Condemning Benjamin Netanyahu and his war in Gaza, and yet they are still part of the supply chain. So, again, it's like I said before, I will never say it's nothing that there's a clear sea change in the rhetoric from some of these powers. And I will never say it's nothing, but it counts for very little because, a little bit of scrutiny into what the actual actions are, like from this excellent report from Arms Embargo Now, shows that it's all talk. It's all about image. They are trying to distance themselves publicly from their connection to Israel. Countries like Canada or Germany or the UK are trying to kind of publicly distance themselves from their connections to Israel while not materially severing them because of, Israel itself serves the interests of, Western imperial power in the Middle East for the purpose of resource extraction and the purpose of engineering, destabilization for the purposes of regime change to more friendly, more Western-friendly leadership, and also, of course, because of obligations that are part of their alliance with the U.S., which which itself serves interests of Western capital and Western empire, in terms of the imperial wars that America fights, or conflicts it props up, and just a good way to think of Israel is it's just an arm or an outpost, or a avatar of American empire in that MENA region. So in terms of just sort of being here in Toronto, I also just want to sort of highlight kind of what's coming from Toronto and how it's finding its way to Israel. So here we have not as much in terms of weaponry, but we do have, again, more like electronics or other component parts that are coming from companies like Dish Unlimited, Pixis Technologies, Enercorp Instruments, Nexia Canada, etc. that are all bound for Elbit Systems in Israel. And again, arriving in Israel as recently as this May. And a lot of this stuff is coming from Toronto and going through France before heading to Tel Aviv. So just interesting to note. The other thing, because you'll notice here's a bunch of different like Elbit systems. There's Elbit Systems Cyclone. There's Elbit Systems. What was the other one? Oh, Carmiel. And the report also does break down what the different Elbit Systems detachments or parts of the organization are. Oh no, the stream has lagged. So Elbit Systems here. So Advanced Technology Center in Carmel. So this is the corporate headquarters and primary R&D hub. So this sort of oversees the company's entire portfolio of defense electronic systems. Then Cyclone in Carmiel specializes in design, manufacture, and maintenance of metal and composite structures for aircraft. And then in the electronics warfare and signals intelligence in Holland, develops advanced electronic warfare and signals intelligence. So this is probably where they develop maybe guidance systems, but probably also drones as well. So, for example, so the stuff coming out of so I guess like sort of it's also, I think, that Elbit Systems and Carmiel, Elbit Systems Limited, seems to also be like the primary, I think, like receiving hub for a lot of these parts. But for example, out of Halifax, a lot of aircraft parts are coming out of Halifax, and going for use in the F-35, the IOF variant of the F-35. So I also wanted to talk about specifically the part of the report that about sort of the F-35. The Israeli military has a variant of the Lockheed Martin F-35 called the F-35I Adir, and is capable of carrying 9 tons of bombs and missiles, and it's the central component of the aerial bombardments that Israel has done in Gaza, which are largely responsible for the flattening of entire cities, where there once were whole thriving neighborhoods, and now it's like, if you've seen some of the footage or images out of Gaza, now it's like these entire cities are literally just piles of rubble or have just been razed to the ground entirely. It is this aircraft that does a lot of that work. And so, interesting to note that this is a study from 2018, but it notes that each of those F-35s that are being used to bomb civilians in Gaza, in U.S. dollars, about $2.3 million of Canadian parts are in those aircraft, and those are parts that are coming from for example, Vancouver aircraft audio amplifier coming out of Vancouver, GPS antennae coming out of Ottawa, military aircraft parts, could be engine parts, could be parts for ordnance bays, or stuff just like the rudders and flaps on the wings, that kind of stuff, coming out of Halifax. So all this, and this sort of, okay, sorry, things got a little laggy there, but all this sort of being like, why, especially kind of last year, in 2024, you've been seeing a lot of I'm not sure about recently, but especially last year in 2024, you were seeing a lot of these road blockades or rail blockades, or I think there were even a few airport blockades, to stop these goods from going. Because, you might hear that, it's like, again, you'll hear, why are you blocking this train or highway or, loading bay? This truck isn't going to Israel, isn't going to an airport or a harbor, or this plane is not bound for Israel, or this ship is not bound for Israel. It's like, but this truck, it's bound for Illinois, or this flight is going down to New York, or this train is bound for Texas. It's not going to Israel. But it's like, or this flight's not going to Israel, it's going to Germany. But it's like this, again, this is part of the routing that these goods take back to what we just talked about with that report in the Star, that even if there are no new permits being approved for stuff going directly to Israel, there are still permits being approved for stuff taking sort of indirect routes to Israel, or there's no permits needed at all if it's going through the U.S. first. And as you can see, especially for stuff coming out of Montreal, a lot of it is going through the U.S. Especially some of the stuff that's weaponry, that's actually explicitly weaponry, it's going through New York. So there's not really any kind of permitting process there. Whereas you'll see with the stuff that's not explicitly weaponry, but is just like electronics, well, it might go instead a more direct or less indirect, might take a less indirect route, where instead of going to the U.S., it'll first land in Europe or Central Asia before going down to Israel, where it will be, those parts will be then assembled into whatever horrific weaponry being used to commit a live streamed Holocaust right before our very eyes. So those are some of like the points that really sort of jumped out here. And then actually there's another part of the report here that goes into detail about what some of these parts actually do, and kind of the companies that manufacture them. For example, here from Nexia Canada, which is one of the companies that I called out in the tables we just looked at. I believe this is one of the ones that is here in Toronto. They are a subsidiary of the German defense firm Hensoldt, and this modular product tester that goes to Elbit Systems in Israel is critical for testing and validating the complex electrical and weapon systems of Israeli military platforms, including the F-35. So, not a weapon, but it is used to make sure that the weapons that are being used to kill civilians are functioning correctly, or the delivery systems for those weapons being used are functioning correctly. So this would be used for like a pre-flight diagnostic that would be done on an F-35 before it takes off to go commit its piece to genocide. It's very much kind of zone of interest, this kind of like banality of evil, where it's like, even if it's like not somewhere that's directly manufacturing explosives or weapons like artillery shells or missiles, or even like the guidance systems that are put onto missiles, it's not a place that's producing warheads for missiles or artillery. It's the electronic systems that just do the mundane day-to-day kind of upkeep to like the maintenance of the software and electronic systems that are used in weaponry like the F-35. What was... what was some of the ones that were in Halifax? Here we are, Halifax. Stelia. So that's what we were just looking at down here. Okay. So then there's Stelia, which is the Stelia here. This is one of the military aircraft or aircraft manufacturers. This is the one that was doing a lot of the manufacturing. This was one of the ones. This was in the Halifax tables. This was where the aircraft parts out of Halifax were coming from. Was from Stelia. all headed to Elbit System Cyclone, which, as we talked about up here, is this is where the manufacture and maintenance of metal and composite structures for military and commercial aircraft is done. And so what exactly does Stelia do? What does military aircraft parts actually mean? So they manufacture and design lightweight composite panels for the F-35 jet, and for the aircraft's fuselage, its body, so it can perform its task in high speed and high stress combat environments. And 5 shipments of these parts were found to have been sent from Canada to Israel between August 2024 and June. I believe this is probably supposed to be June 2025. Let's just confirm that. I believe that's just a typo. Unless maybe that's... Okay, well, sort of in a 10-month period, there were 5 shipments of these parts. So this is essentially responsible for like the actual structural integrity of the aircraft. And then this actually breaks down kind of like the different parts of the F-35 in terms of what Canada's manufacturing has contributed to. So we have like the wing bulkhead, the horizontal tail, the hydraulic actuator system. So this is a system that that when the pilots are using their controls to manipulate the flaps and rudders on the plane to steer it or to control its airspeed, that hydraulic actuator system is how those inputs are turned into action. Those are the things that it's like when the pilot presses a button or moves a stick or moves his controls, that then it's that piece, that actuator, that that then moves that corresponding part. So an engine health monitoring system, external lighting, circuit cards, landing gear, weapon bays, doors, all this stuff is all coming from Canada. And just this accounts for a little over $2 million worth of parts for the F-35, for construction of the F-35. And then just sort of lastly here we have, this is just sort of talking a bit about kind of how this is tracked and kind of where a lot of this information is coming from. So a lot of this is coming from the Israeli Tax Authority, which is an industry or a agency within Israel's Ministry of Finance. And so this here, we have some figures. We have said that Israel has imported about $2.2 million in munitions from Canada. Self-explanatory, but bombs, torpedoes, rockets, $12.5 million in electronic equipment, $2.8 million in military aircraft and aircraft equipment. And this just sort of reiterates that we already said that the data confirms, despite the government's pause on new permit approvals on January 8th, 2024. Stuff's still getting there. Whether it was previously authorized permits that were authorized before the pause was implemented, or just because of the loophole that exists, where if it's going through the U.S., don't need permits, or we're not approving more permits to Israel, but we'll still approve a permit to India. We'll still approve a permit to probably to Saudi Arabia. will still approve a permit to Paris, like to France. Really, really great report here that I think gives a very thorough and detailed picture of just kind of how far in Canada is for aiding and abetting the genocide of Palestinians, and that still a lot of this stuff about pausing permits, or we're going to in some ways control or clamp down on military goods going to Israel, is still kind of hollow, because it may clamp down on stuff that's going directly to Israel, but as we saw in the reporting there, a lot of that stuff is not on a direct route to Israel. A lot of that stuff is routed through other allied countries for the purposes of making it easier to get those exports cleared by Global Affairs Canada. And so I know that Carney had said that we'll be joining France in recognizing a Palestinian state by September, and we talked a bit about how that itself is kind of hollow, because it's coming with all of these conditions that are primarily conditions that are in the interest of Israel, not in the interest of Palestinians. In terms of there cannot be any sort of standing army in Gaza. The control of Gaza would be turned over to the Palestinian Authority, which is just an arm of the Israel's security apparatus. So very kind of hollow language that is meant to just sort of, the real goal is just to reset things back to where they were pre-October 7. And I think what this report does is it further underscores how hollow and how unscrupulous this language from the Canadian government is, because we're very much involved in supporting Israel's genocide, but we're doing it in sort of these roundabout ways where it's harder to track. Like this information, like we just talked about, came from the Israeli Ministry of Finance. It was not coming from, or not it was not as much coming from our own reporting, because our own reporting doesn't give a complete picture because of some of these loopholes that we talked about. So that's kind of, again, very shameful on the part of the Canadian government. We should be very ashamed of and outraged, more importantly, outraged by what the Canadian government is doing here, and recognize our own complicity, because not only is this being done in our name as Canadian citizens, this is also our tax dollars at work. These weapons manufacturers are receiving Canadian taxpayer money to purchase these weapons, or they receive subsidies in other forms that are Canadian taxpayer dollars sent to support these companies, these weapons manufacturers, because they are military contractors. They work for our military interests, and by extension the military interests of our allies, which include the U.S. and Israel. So that's I think where we're going to cut it for today. I want to thank you so much for tuning in. And we are going to we're gonna send things over to the majority report now. In just a second here. But I hope you have a great weekend. And if you're in a jurisdiction where it's a long weekend, we have a great long weekend. As always, if you miss a stream, you can always find the VODs here on Twitch, or as well as on my YouTube channel, which is Mothy with a 0, so M0THY, Mothy 1994 over on YouTube. It's linked in my bio here. As well, you can find the links to this report from Arms Embargo Now in that description here on Twitch and on YouTube. So then you can have a look for yourself, which I strongly encourage that you do. I strongly encourage that you do not just take my word for what I'm saying here, but that you go and not only read the report itself, but also go and investigate all the other reports and studies and publications that the report cited to ensure that you are getting a full, complete picture here, because this is some great work being done, and it's great that this is accessible and free. So yeah, so definitely go and check that out. Yeah, so okay. So yeah. Thanks so much for tuning in. Hope you have a great weekend. And we are going to send it over to the majority report now. And we'll see you back here Tuesday at 11 a.m., 8 a.m. Pacific. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
And that's when you first see the policy of mandatory detention become law in 1980.